The morning coffee tasted bitter in Rachel Thompson's mouth as she sat in her cramped cubicle at Denver International Airport's administrative offices. Through the window, she could see the endless stream of aircraft taxiing across the tarmac, their engines gleaming in the early sunlight. Once, that sight would have filled her with longing. Now it just reminded her of everything she'd lost. Thompson, my office. Now. The voice belonged to Marcus Weber, the airport's chief of flight operations and the man who had made her life miserable for the past 8 months. His tone carried that familiar edge of disdain that had become as routine as her morning commute. Rachel straightened her shoulders and walked toward Weber's corner office, past the whispered conversations of her colleagues who had learned to avoid eye contact whenever Weber summoned her. The man's reputation preceded him everywhere he went. Brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely intolerant of what he called failed pilots pretending to be useful. Sit, Weber commanded without looking up from his paperwork. His office walls were covered with commendations, flight certifications, and photographs of him shaking hands with airline executives. Not a single image showed him actually flying, which, as Rachel had learned, was because Weber hadn't been cleared for active duty in over 15 years due to a vision problem he'd successfully hidden from most people. Your quarterly review is coming up, he continued, finally lifting his eyes to meet hers. And frankly, I'm not impressed with your performance in airport logistics coordination. Rachel bit back her first response. She had been managing flight scheduling and emergency protocols flawlessly for months, often working unpaid overtime to ensure everything ran smoothly. Her direct supervisor, Lisa Chun, had even mentioned submitting her for a Departmental Excellence award, but Weber had made it clear that Rachel's opinions and achievements meant nothing to him. I've been handling my responsibilities according to department standards, she said carefully. Weber leaned back in his leather chair, a thin smile playing in his lips. Standards? You mean the bare minimum? That's exactly what I'd expect from someone who couldn't hack it as a real pilot. The words hit like a physical blow. Rachel's dismissal from the Air Force flight program was a wound that had never fully healed. She'd been told she was too emotional under pressure, that she lacked the instinctive command presence needed for critical situations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now spent her days managing the very emergencies she'd supposedly been unfit to handle in the air. My flight training was exemplary, she said quietly. The evaluation committee had concerns about your ability to make life or death decisions without falling apart, Weber interrupted. Which is why you're shuffling papers instead of flying planes. And frankly, even the paper shuffling could use improvement. Rachel felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. What specifically needs improvement? My emergency response protocols have been implemented airport-wide. My scheduling efficiency has reduced delays by 12% this quarter. Weber waved a dismissive hand. Numbers on a spreadsheet don't impress me. What impresses me is real world capability. And you've proven you don't have what it takes when it really matters. Before Rachel could respond, Weber's phone rang. He answered with his usual brusque efficiency, discussing maintenance schedules with someone from the control tower. Rachel sat in uncomfortable silence, studying the man who seemed determined to make her question every decision that had led her to this moment. You can go, Weber said after hanging up, not bothering to look at her again. But Thompson? Start thinking about whether airport operations is really the right fit for you. I'd hate to see you fail here too. Rachel walked back to her desk with Weber's words echoing in her mind. Around her, the bustling airport continued its daily rhythm. Thousands of passengers trusting their lives to pilots and systems and procedures that people like her helped coordinate from the ground. She had once dreamed of being up there with them, commanding aircraft through storms and turbulence and impossible situations. Instead, She was here, managing spreadsheets and enduring the daily humiliation of working under a man who seemed to take personal pleasure in reminding her of her failed dreams. But as Rachel sat down and opened her computer to review the day's flight schedules, she couldn't shake the feeling that Weber's hostility went deeper than simple disdain for unsuccessful pilots. There was something personal in his attacks, something that suggested he saw her as more than just an easy target for his frustrations. She pulled up the afternoon departure schedules and noticed something odd. Flight 982 to Seattle was listed with an unusual maintenance note, a minor hydraulic issue that had been marked as resolved without the typical sign-off from the head mechanic. It was probably nothing, but Rachel had learned to pay attention to details that others might miss. As she reached for her phone to call the maintenance supervisor, she caught sight of Weber through his office window. He was on another call, gesturing animatedly, his face flushed with anger. Something about his expression made her pause, a sudden instinct warning her that today was going to be different from all the others. She just didn't know how different yet. The maintenance supervisor's voice crackled through Rachel's headset as she stood in the bustling departure gate area. The hydraulic system on 982 was giving us some readings this morning, but we ran a full diagnostic. Everything's within normal parameters now. Rachel frowned, watching through the terminal windows as ground crews prepared the aircraft for departure. Who signed off on the clearance? I don't see Peterson's signature on the digital log. That's because Weber overrode the protocol. Said we were behind schedule and couldn't afford delays for phantom problems. The mechanic's tone carried clear frustration. Look, Rachel, I've been doing this for 23 years. That bird should have gotten a secondary inspection, but Weber pulled rank. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. She'd seen Weber cut corners before, usually on minor procedural issues that barely affected operations. But aircraft maintenance wasn't something you compromised on, especially not hydraulic systems that controlled critical flight functions. Thanks for letting me know, she said, already heading back toward the administrative offices. I'll look into it. Be careful, the mechanic warned. Weber's been gunning for anyone who questions his decisions lately. Word is he's trying to clean house before the new regional director takes over next month. Rachel ended the call and quickened her pace. The new regional director. She'd heard rumors about management changes, but Weber had kept the administrative staff largely in the dark about the transition details. If he was feeling pressure from above, that might explain his increasingly erratic behavior. Back at her desk, she pulled up the maintenance logs and cross-referenced them with Weber's override authorizations. What she found made her stomach clench. Over the past 6 weeks, Weber had bypassed standard inspection protocols on 7 different aircraft, all in the name of operational efficiency. None of the incidents had resulted in problems, but the pattern was deeply troubling. Find something interesting? The voice belonged to David Park, a fellow coordinator who worked in the adjacent cubicle. He was one of the few colleagues who still treated Rachel with genuine respect, perhaps because he'd also faced Weber's wrath on more than one occasion. Maybe, Rachel said carefully. David, have you noticed anything unusual about Weber's decision-making lately? Specifically regarding maintenance protocols? David glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. Actually, yes. I've been wondering if someone should say something to the union rep. Weber's been pushing back on safety checks, pressuring mechanics to work faster, generally acting like the rules don't apply to him. Why hasn't anyone reported it? Because Weber's been systematically documenting every minor mistake any of us make, David whispered. He's building cases for dismissal. Anyone who crosses him gets put under a microscope. Look what he's done to you. You're the most competent person in this department, and he treats you like you're incompetent. Rachel felt a surge of validation. She'd begun to wonder if Weber's treatment of her was justified, if perhaps she really was as inadequate as he constantly suggested. Knowing that David and others had noticed the unfairness helped restore some of her confidence. What about the new regional director? Could we approach them directly? David shook his head. Weber's been feeding them selective information for weeks. As far as the new boss knows, Weber's a model of efficiency, and anyone who complains about him is just a disgruntled employee trying to cause trouble. Before Rachel could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Weber's extension. Thompson, Gate 37. Now, we have a situation. She hurried through the terminal corridors, her mind racing. Gate 37 was where Flight 982 was boarding, the same aircraft she'd been concerned about. As she approached, she could see Weber in animated conversation with a flight attendant, his face red with frustration. "There you are," Weber snapped when he saw her. "We have passengers complaining about boarding delays, and the crew is being overly cautious about some minor mechanical issues. I need you to coordinate with ground control and get this bird in the air." "What kind of mechanical issues?" Rachel asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Nothing significant. The pilot is being paranoid about hydraulic pressure readings that are well within acceptable ranges. I need you to communicate to the captain that we have operational priorities here." Rachel felt her throat tighten. "Sir, if the pilot has concerns about aircraft safety, the pilot's concerns are noted and dismissed," Weber interrupted. "I've reviewed the maintenance logs personally. This aircraft is cleared for departure. Your job is to facilitate that departure, not to second-guess qualified personnel." But Rachel could see past Weber's confident facade. His hands were trembling slightly, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool terminal air conditioning. Whatever pressure he was under, it was making him reckless. "I'll speak with the gate supervisor," she said finally. "You'll speak with the captain," Weber corrected. "And you'll make it clear that further delays will result in a formal complaint being filed against the flight crew for operational insubordination." As Weber stalked away, Rachel stood frozen in the boarding area, watching passengers file onto the aircraft that she now strongly suspected shouldn't be flying. The captain's caution wasn't paranoia. It was exactly the kind of careful attention to safety that kept people alive. But Weber held all the authority, and she was just a failed pilot managing logistics from the ground. Or so she thought, until she realized that she still had one option that Weber hadn't considered. She could board that flight herself. Rachel's hand shook as she typed her resignation letter at 11:30 that evening. The fluorescent lights in the empty administrative office cast harsh shadows across her desk, and the silence felt oppressive after the day's chaos. She'd stayed late to finish her regular duties, but her mind kept circling back to Flight 982 and the conversation she'd overheard Weber having with his supervisor. The new regional director doesn't need to know about every minor protocol deviation, Weber had said into his phone, thinking his office was empty. What matters is operational efficiency and cost control. Safety margins exist for a reason. They're designed to be flexible. But Rachel knew better. Safety margins weren't suggestions. They were the difference between routine flights and disasters. And Weber's increasingly reckless attitude was going to get people killed. The breaking point had come 3 hours later when she tried one final time to raise her concerns through proper channels. She'd called the Federal Aviation Oversight Office only to be told that any safety complaints needed to be filed through the airport's internal reporting system, the same system that Weber controlled. "Ms. Thompson?" The voice startled her. She looked up to see David Park standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I saw your light on. Figured you might need this." "Thanks," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Just finishing up some paperwork." David sat down in the chair beside her desk, his expression serious. "Rachel, I know what you're thinking about that flight today. And I know what Weber said to you at the gate." "I'm not thinking anything," she said automatically. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job doesn't include watching Weber put lives at risk while you stay silent." David's voice was quiet but firm. "Look, I've been here 8 years. I've seen good people driven out for asking the right questions. But I've never seen someone compromise aircraft safety as blatantly as Weber did today." Rachel stared at her computer screen where her resignation letter waited in the draft folder. "What am I supposed to do? I'm a failed pilot managing spreadsheets. Weber's made it clear that my opinions don't matter." "Maybe your opinions don't matter to Weber," David said. "But they matter to the people who get on those planes. And they should matter to you." Before Rachel could respond, the office's main phone rang. David answered it, his expression growing increasingly grim as he listened. "That was airport operations," he said after hanging up. "Flight 982 experienced hydraulic failure over Colorado. They're declaring an emergency and attempting to return to Denver." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. The aircraft she'd been worried about, the one Weber had pushed into service despite maintenance concerns, was now in serious trouble with 181 people aboard. "Is there anything we can do from here?" she asked, her training automatically kicking in despite her current role. "Weber's already in the Emergency Operations Center," David said. "He's coordinating with air traffic control and emergency services." But Rachel... He hesitated. "The early reports suggest complete hydraulic system failure. That aircraft is going to need an extremely skilled pilot to bring it down safely." Rachel closed her eyes, imagining the scene in the cockpit. The captain would be running through emergency procedures while the co-pilot worked frantically to restore systems that might not respond. The passengers would be terrified, possibly unaware of how serious their situation really was. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that this was exactly the kind of scenario her Air Force instructors had used to justify washing her out of the program. They've said she couldn't handle the pressure of life or death decisions, that she'd freeze up when people's lives depended on her actions. "I need to get down there," she said suddenly, standing up from her desk. "To the operations center? Weber won't want you anywhere near this situation. He'll blame you for raising concerns about the aircraft in the first place." "No," Rachel said, grabbing her jacket and emergency credentials. "I need to get to the departure gate. I need to be on the next flight to Seattle." David stared at her in confusion. "Rachel, what are you talking about? There won't be any flights to Seattle tonight, not with an emergency aircraft inbound." She turned to face him, and for the first time in months, her voice carried the authority she'd once possessed as a cadet. "Then I need to find another way to get there. Because if that aircraft manages to land safely, the passengers are going to need someone who understands what really happened. Someone who can make sure Weber doesn't bury this under bureaucratic paperwork. And if it doesn't land safely?" Rachel met his eyes. "Then I need to be there to make sure the truth comes out about why it was flying in the first place." As she walked toward the elevator, leaving David and her resignation letter behind, Rachel realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. For 8 months, she'd accepted Weber's assessment of her capabilities, allowing his constant criticism to reinforce her own doubts about her worth as a pilot and as a person. But watching him gamble with people's lives had awakened something she'd thought was dead, the protective instinct that had driven her to pursue aviation in the first place. She might be a failed pilot, but she was still someone who understood aircraft systems and emergency procedures. And right now, that knowledge was the only thing standing between Weber's recklessness and a tragedy he could cover up. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Rachel realized she wasn't heading home after all. She was heading toward the biggest fight of her life. Rachel's laptop screen glowed in the dim light of her apartment as she worked through the night, cross-referencing maintenance records, overtime schedules, and Weber's override authorizations. The emergency landing of Flight 982 had succeeded, barely, but the aircraft had suffered catastrophic hydraulic damage that investigators were already calling preventable with proper inspection protocols. By dawn, she had assembled a comprehensive file documenting Weber's pattern of safety violations over the past 3 months. More importantly, she discovered something that made her hands tremble as she typed. Weber had been falsifying inspection records to meet performance metrics demanded by airline cost-cutting initiatives. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Weber called emergency staff meeting for 8 a.m. Says he's conducting internal review of yesterday's incident. You should be there. Rachel glanced at the clock. 6:15. She had less than 2 hours to prepare for what would likely be Weber's attempt to control the narrative around the emergency landing. But now she had ammunition. She printed out her research, organized it into clear sections, and prepared copies for every member of the administrative staff. If Weber wanted to frame yesterday's incident as an unavoidable mechanical failure, he was going to face some uncomfortable questions. The conference room was packed when Rachel arrived at 7:58, deliberately timing her entrance to avoid giving Weber a chance to dismiss her before the meeting started. She took a seat near the back, her folder of documents concealed in her lap. "Ladies and gentlemen," Weber began, his voice carrying forced confidence. "Yesterday's emergency landing was successfully resolved through excellent coordination between our operations center and emergency services. The aircraft landed safely. All passengers and crew are unharmed, and normal operations have resumed." He paused, scanning the room with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd controlled a potentially damaging situation. However, he continued, "The Federal Aviation Authority will be conducting a routine investigation into the mechanical failure. During this investigation, it's important that we present a unified account of our operations and procedures. Any deviation from established protocols should be reported through proper channels to avoid confusion or misunderstanding." Rachel felt her pulse quicken. Weber was essentially instructing the staff to conceal any irregularities they might have noticed. It was a clear attempt to obstruct the federal investigation. "Are there any questions?" Weber asked, his tone suggesting he expected none. Rachel stood up. "I have several questions." The room fell silent. Weber's expression shifted from confidence to annoyance, then to something approaching alarm as he recognized the determination in Rachel's posture. "Ms. Thompson, I don't think this is the appropriate forum for—" "Actually, I think it's exactly the appropriate forum," Rachel interrupted, opening her folder. "Especially since you've asked us to present a unified account of our operations and procedures." She pulled out the first set of documents. "For instance, I'd like clarification on your 7 override authorizations for maintenance protocols over the past 6 weeks, including the specific override that allowed Flight 982 to depart yesterday despite unresolved hydraulic concerns." Weber's face flushed red. "Those authorizations were made within my operational authority based on review of falsified inspection reports," Rachel continued, producing another set of papers. "I have the documentation showing that the maintenance sign-offs for those 7 aircraft were backdated, and that the actual inspections were either incomplete or skipped entirely." The room erupted in whispers. David Park was staring at Rachel with open admiration, while several other staff members began pulling out their own notes and files, as if suddenly remembering irregularities they'd been afraid to mention. "Ms. Thompson," Weber said, his voice dangerously low, "you are speaking about matters outside your area of responsibility and expertise. I suggest you Suggest you explain to this room why the hydraulic system that failed yesterday was marked as cleared in your override authorization, despite the fact that the required secondary inspection never took place. Rachel shot. Back-dawed, she turned to address the room. Everyone here knows that yesterday's emergency could have been prevented. We all know that proper safety protocols exist for a reason. And we all know that those protocols have been systematically ignored. In the name of operational efficiency. Weber slammed his hand on the conference table. That's enough, Ms. Thompson. You are terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. But before Weber could reach for his phone, Lisa Chun, Rachel's direct supervisor, stood up from her seat near the front of the room. Actually, Marcus, I don't think that's going to happen, Lisa said calmly. Because while you've been conducting this meeting, I've been on the phone with the new regional director. And it turns out they're very interested in reviewing the documentation that Rachel has compiled. Weber's face went pale. What documentation? The documentation that shows a pattern of safety violations, protocol overrides, and inspection irregularities that directly contributed to yesterday's emergency, Lisa replied. The documentation that Rachel sent to the Federal Aviation Authority this morning at 6 a.m. Rachel felt a surge of gratitude toward Lisa, but also a moment of confusion. She hadn't sent anything to the federal authorities yet. She'd been planning to present her findings to Weber first, hoping to resolve the situation internally. But as Lisa met her eyes and gave an almost imperceptible nod, Rachel realized what was happening. Lisa was forcing Weber's hand, making him believe that the investigation was already underway and that his attempts at cover-up were futile. You can't do this, Weber said, but his voice had lost its authority. I've been managing operations successfully for 8 months, Lisa interrupted. 8 months during which safety violations have increased by 300%, and maintenance delays have been consistently overridden against expert recommendations. The regional director is very interested in understanding how these patterns developed. Rachel remained standing, her documents still in hand, as she watched Weber's carefully constructed authority crumble around him. For months, he'd used his position to intimidate and silence anyone who questioned his decisions. Now, faced with documented evidence of his recklessness, he looked like what he really was, a man in over his head, making dangerous decisions to protect his own career. The meeting is over, Weber said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Everyone return to your normal duties. But as the staff began to file out, Rachel noticed that several of them approached Lisa with their own folders and notes. The documentation she'd compiled wasn't just evidence of Weber's violations. It was permission for others to come forward with their own concerns. The investigation was just beginning. The Federal Aviation Authority's regional office buzzed with activity as Rachel sat across from Senior Inspector Janet Morrison, a woman whose 25 years of accident investigation experience showed in every carefully worded question. It had been 3 days since the staff meeting confrontation, and Weber's attempts to discredit Rachel's evidence had only succeeded in drawing more scrutiny to his operations. Ms. Thompson, Inspector Morrison said, reviewing the comprehensive file Rachel had submitted, this documentation represents one of the most thorough safety violation reports I've seen from an airport administrative employee. Your background in flight training clearly shows in the technical accuracy of your analysis. Rachel felt a mixture of vindication and nervousness. I just documented what I observed. The patterns became obvious once I started looking at the data. Systematically, indeed. And those patterns have been corroborated by 6 other employees who've come forward since your initial report. Morrison leaned forward. However, I need to ask you directly, are you prepared for the professional consequences of this investigation? Mr. Weber has already filed formal complaints against you, claiming insubordination and deliberate interference with airport operations. "He's trying to protect himself," Rachel replied. "But Inspector Morrison, those passengers on Flight 982 could have died because Weber prioritized schedule adherence over aircraft safety. If standing up to that kind of recklessness costs me my job, then so be it." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the attitude we need from airport personnel. Now, I need to inform you that our investigation has uncovered additional issues beyond what you documented. Weber's violations appear to be part of a broader pattern of cost-cutting measures that compromise safety protocols." Before Rachel could respond, Morrison's assistant knocked on the door. "Inspector, the regional director from Denver International is here for the 3 o'clock meeting." Rachel's stomach tightened. She'd heard rumors that the new regional director was conducting their own internal investigation, but she didn't know what that meant for her future employment or for the broader safety issues she'd exposed. "Send them in," Morrison said. "Miss Thompson, I'd like you to stay for this conversation." The woman who entered the office was tall, professional, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. She introduced herself as Director Amanda Foster and shook Rachel's hand with a firm grip. "Miss Thompson, I've been reviewing your employment record and the circumstances that led to your safety report," Director Foster said, taking a seat. "I want you to know that the airport authority takes these issues extremely seriously, and we're grateful that you had the courage to come forward." "What's going to happen to Weber?" Rachel asked directly. "Mr. Weber has been suspended pending the completion of this investigation," Foster replied. "If the violations are confirmed, he'll face federal charges for endangering aircraft operations. More importantly, we're implementing immediate changes to prevent similar situations in the future." Inspector Morrison consulted her notes. "Director Foster, what can you tell us about the cost-cutting pressures that may have influenced Mr. Weber's decisions?" Foster's expression grew grim. "That's something we're investigating thoroughly. There's preliminary evidence that Weber was responding to unofficial pressure from airline representatives to reduce maintenance delays and inspection times. If that's confirmed, the responsible parties will face serious consequences." Rachel felt a surge of hope. For months, she'd felt powerless against Weber's authority and the system that protected him. Now that same system was responding to documented evidence of safety violations with the seriousness they deserved. "Miss Thompson," Foster continued, "I have a proposition for you. The airport authority is creating a new position, safety compliance coordinator, with direct reporting authority to my office. The role would involve monitoring operational procedures, investigating safety concerns, and ensuring that incidents like this never happen again." Rachel stared at her in surprise. "You're offering me a promotion?" "I'm offering you a chance to use your aviation training and analytical skills to protect passenger safety on a systematic level," Foster clarified. "The position would come with the authority to halt operations when safety protocols are violated, regardless of cost or schedule considerations." It was more than Rachel had dared to hope for. After months of being treated as a failed pilot with nothing valuable to contribute, she was being offered a role that would put her aviation expertise at the center of airport safety operations. "There is one condition," Foster added. "You need to complete additional certification in federal aviation safety protocols. The training program is intensive, 6 months of coursework and practical exercises. Are you prepared for that commitment?" Rachel thought about the passengers on Flight 982, about the terror they must have experienced during the emergency landing, about the fact that their lives had been endangered by preventable safety violations. She thought about Weber's months of harassment and his attempts to make her believe she was worthless as an aviation professional. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm prepared." Inspector Morrison smiled. "Excellent. Ms. Thompson, your willingness to challenge authority when safety is at stake is exactly what the aviation industry needs more of. Too many accidents happen because qualified people stay silent rather than risk their careers. As the meeting concluded and paperwork was exchanged, Rachel realized that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with aviation. For years, after her dismissal from flight training, she'd seen herself as someone who'd failed to become a pilot. Now she understood that her real calling might be protecting the people who trusted their lives to the aviation system every day. Weber had tried to silence her because he knew she was competent enough to recognize his violations. He'd failed because he underestimated her determination to protect passenger safety, regardless of the personal cost. The system had responded, and now it was time for Rachel to step into the role she'd been preparing for her entire career. The conference room at Denver International Airport felt charged with tension as Rachel sat across from Weber for the first time since his suspension 2 weeks earlier. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in an expensive suit, had requested this meeting as part of Weber's attempt to negotiate a settlement. Before formal federal charges were filed, Rachel was no longer alone. Director Foster sat beside her, along with the Airport Authority's legal counsel and Inspector Morrison from the Federal Aviation Authority. The balance of power had shifted dramatically since that first humiliating encounter in Weber's office months earlier. Let's be clear about why we're here. Weber's attorney began, consulting her notes. My client maintains that the safety concerns raised by Ms. Thompson were exaggerated, and that his operational decisions were within the scope of his authority as Chief of Flight Operations. Weber himself looked haggard, his usual commanding presence replaced by defensive uncertainty. I made difficult decisions under pressure, he said, his voice lacking its former confidence. Airport operations require balancing safety concerns with practical realities. Every delay costs money and creates cascading problems throughout the system. Rachel felt a familiar anger rising, but she kept her voice level. Mr. Weber, the hydraulic system on Flight 982 failed exactly as the maintenance crew predicted it might. 181 people could have died because you prioritize schedule adherence over aircraft safety. That's speculation, Weber's attorney interjected. The aircraft landed safely, and there's no conclusive evidence that my client's decisions directly caused the mechanical failure. Inspector Morrison leaned forward, opening a thick folder. Actually, our investigation has conclusively determined that the hydraulic system failure was directly attributable to deferred maintenance that Mr. Weber approved despite explicit warnings from certified mechanics. She pulled out a series of documents. Furthermore, we've discovered that Mr. Weber systematically falsified inspection records, overrode safety protocols, and threatened airport personnel who raised concerns about his decisions. Weber's face flushed red. Those are lies. I never threatened anyone. I simply maintained operational discipline and expected employees to perform their duties competently. Like the way you maintained operational discipline with me? Rachel asked, her years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. For 8 months, you told me I was incompetent, that I was a failed pilot who had no business questioning your decisions. You used your position to humiliate and silence me because you knew I had the training to recognize your safety violations. Weber started to respond, but Rachel continued, her voice growing stronger. You convinced me that my concerns didn't matter, that my aviation background was worthless, that I should be grateful just to have a job organizing spreadsheets. But the truth is, you were terrified that someone with actual flight training would expose your reckless corner cutting. Ms. Thompson, Weber's attorney said sharply, accusations of personal harassment are documented. Director Foster interrupted, sliding another folder across the table. We've interviewed 17 airport Employees who witnessed Mr. Weber's systematic harassment of Ms. Thompson and others who raised safety concerns. The pattern of intimidation is clear and well established. Weber slumped in his chair, the weight of the evidence finally seeming to penetrate his defenses. "I was under pressure," he said quietly. The airline representatives were demanding faster turnaround times, reduced maintenance delays. My job was on the line if I couldn't meet their efficiency targets. "So, you decided to gamble with passenger safety instead of your own career security," Rachel said. "You chose to risk other people's lives rather than stand up to pressure from your superiors." Inspector Morrison consulted her notes. "Mr. Weber, we have recorded conversations between you and airline representatives in which you explicitly agreed to streamline safety protocols in exchange for contract renewals. Those conversations constitute federal crimes." The room fell silent. Weber's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but he seemed barely aware of her presence. The full scope of his legal jeopardy was finally becoming clear. "What do you want?" Weber asked finally, his voice defeated. Director Foster spoke first. "Full cooperation with the federal investigation, including testimony about pressure from airline representatives. Complete disclosure of all safety protocol violations during your tenure. And a formal apology to the airport staff you intimidated and harassed. And criminal accountability," Inspector Morrison added. "The federal charges will proceed regardless of any civil settlement. Passenger safety isn't negotiable." Weber looked across the table at Rachel, his expression a mixture of resentment and something that might have been regret. "You destroyed my career," he said. Rachel met his eyes without flinching. "No, Marcus. You destroyed your own career the moment you decided that protecting your position was more important than protecting the people who trusted you to keep them safe. I just made sure the truth came out before someone died because of your decisions." Weber's attorney gathered her papers. "We need time to consider our options." "You have 24 hours, Inspector Morrison replied. "After that, the federal indictment proceeds with or without cooperation." As the room emptied, Rachel remained seated, processing the confrontation she'd been preparing for throughout the investigation. Weber had tried one final time to shift blame and avoid responsibility, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the system had finally responded appropriately. Director Foster placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "That took courage. Standing up to authority figures who abuse their power isn't easy, especially when your own career is at stake." Rachel nodded, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. He was right about one thing. I did destroy his career. But some careers deserve to be destroyed when they're built on endangering innocent people. Tomorrow, she would begin her training as Safety Compliance Coordinator, using her aviation expertise to prevent other officials from making Weber's dangerous choices. But today, she had faced down the man who tried to convince her she was worthless and proven that competence and courage could triumph over corruption and intimidation. The confrontation was over. Justice was just beginning. 6 months later, Rachel stood in the observation deck of Denver International Airport, watching aircraft taxi along the same runways where Weber had once prioritized efficiency over safety. A new badge read Safety Compliance Coordinator, and the authority it represented had already prevented 3 potential safety violations in her first month on the job. The federal courthouse across the city had just delivered its verdict in the case against Marcus Weber. 3 counts of criminal negligence, 2 counts of federal safety violations, and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud safety inspections. The judge had sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison, followed by permanent disbarment from any aviation industry position. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Director Foster approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd seen justice properly served. I was thinking about that first day in Weber's office, Rachel said, accepting the coffee gratefully. When he told me I was a failed pilot who should be grateful just to shuffle papers. I almost believed him. What changed your mind? Rachel gestured toward the aircraft below, realizing that those passengers' lives mattered more than my own insecurities. Weber tried to make me believe that my aviation training was worthless, but the truth is, the training gave me the knowledge to recognize what he was doing wrong. Foster nodded. The airline executives who pressured Weber into cutting corners received their own consequences. Federal investigators traced the cost-cutting demands back to 3 major carriers who were threatening to move their operations unless maintenance times were reduced. All 3 companies are facing massive fines and federal oversight. Good, Rachel said firmly. The pressure Weber felt was real, but it doesn't excuse endangering lives. A real leader would have pushed back against unrealistic demands instead of compromising safety. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. It was from Captain James Harrison, the pilot who had successfully landed Flight 982 during the hydraulic emergency. He'd become something of a mentor to Rachel during the investigation, helping her understand the pilot's perspective on the safety violations Weber had authorized. Coffee tomorrow? The message. Read. Want to discuss the new emergency protocol training you developed. Rachel had spent the past month designing enhanced emergency response procedures that would ensure better communication between ground operations and flight crews during crisis situations. The program was being implemented airport-wide and had already attracted interest from aviation authorities in other cities. You know, Foster said, watching Rachel respond to the message. When I first heard about your confrontation with Weber, I wondered if you might be a disgruntled employee looking for revenge. But the more I learned about your background and your methodical documentation of safety violations, the more impressed I became. I wasn't looking for revenge, Rachel replied. I was looking for justice. There's a difference. Explain that to me. Rachel thought for a moment, watching a maintenance crew perform their pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness that Weber had tried to eliminate. Revenge would have been trying to destroy Weber personally because he made my life miserable. Justice was ensuring that his dangerous practices couldn't hurt anyone else, regardless of what happened to him personally. Foster smiled. That's exactly the attitude we need in aviation safety. Personal feelings can't override professional responsibility. A commotion near the departure gates caught Rachel's attention. She could see airport security responding to what appeared to be an agitated passenger, and her new instincts kicked in automatically. As safety compliance coordinator, she was responsible for monitoring any situation that might affect airport operations. I should check on that, she said, already moving toward the elevator. Rachel, Foster called after her. Remember, you have authority now. Use it. 20 minutes later, Rachel had helped resolve a situation involving a passenger who was concerned about unusual engine noises during aircraft startup. The old Rachel might have dismissed the concern as passenger anxiety, but her new role had taught her to take every safety observation seriously. It turned out the passenger was a retired aircraft mechanic who had correctly identified a minor issue with engine timing. The flight was delayed for additional inspection, and a potential problem was caught before it could develop into something serious. Nice work, Captain Harrison said, appearing beside her as the situation concluded. He'd been deadheading on the flight and had assisted with the technical evaluation. 6 months ago, that passenger's concern would have been ignored because Weber trained staff to prioritize schedules over safety observations. 6 months ago, I would have been too intimidated to speak up, even if I'd noticed the problem myself. Rachel admitted. Weber convinced a lot of us that our opinions didn't matter. Harrison studied her thoughtfully. You know, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. The airline industry needs more people with your combination of technical knowledge and moral courage. Have you ever considered returning to flight training? Rachel felt her heart skip. I was washed out of the Air Force program. They said I couldn't handle pressure situations. They said that before you successfully identified and documented systematic safety violations while under intense personal and professional pressure, Harrison pointed out. They said that before you stood up to a superior who was trying to destroy your career. And they said that before you helped prevent multiple safety incidents through careful analysis and decisive action. He handed her a business card. I know a civilian flight school that specializes in training experienced aviation professionals who want to transition into commercial piloting. They're particularly interested in candidates with your safety-focused background. Rachel stared at the card, feeling possibilities she'd thought were forever closed beginning to reopen. You think I could actually become a pilot? I think you already are a pilot, Harrison said. You've just been flying from the ground instead of from the cockpit. The question is whether you want to expand your capabilities. That evening, Rachel sat in her apartment with the flight school brochure spread across her kitchen table. The program Harrison had recommended was designed specifically for aviation professionals who had the technical knowledge but needed practical flight experience. Students learn not just piloting skills, but advanced safety management and emergency response procedures. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her parents' number. Rachel, honey, we saw the news about your promotion, her mother said excitedly. We're so proud of you for standing up to that horrible man and protecting all those passengers. Thanks, Mom. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. Your father wants to talk to you, her mother continued. He has something he's been wanting to say since this whole situation started. Rachel's father came on the line, his voice carrying a warmth she hadn't heard in years. Sweetheart, when you left the Air Force program, I thought maybe aviation just wasn't meant to be. But watching you handle this situation with such intelligence and courage, I realize you never stopped being a pilot. You just found a different way to keep people safe in the air. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes. Dad, I'm thinking about trying again. Actually learning to fly commercially this time. Then you should do it, he said firmly. The aviation industry needs people like you. People who put safety first. Who stand up for what's right, who don't let anyone tell them they're not good enough. After ending the call, Rachel picked up the flight school application and began filling it out. Weber had tried to convince her that her failed military training meant she was unfit for aviation careers. But the truth was exactly the opposite. Her aviation knowledge had enabled her to recognize his safety violations, and her determination to protect passenger safety had given her the courage to fight back against his abuse of authority. Tomorrow, she would submit her application to return to flight training. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel proud of what she'd accomplished as safety compliance coordinator. She'd taken on a corrupt system, exposed dangerous practices, and helped ensure that future passengers would be protected by stronger safety protocols. Weber was in federal prison. The airlines responsible for pressuring him were facing oversight and fines, and the airport had implemented new procedures that would prevent similar violations. Most importantly, Rachel had proven to herself that her aviation training and safety instincts were valuable assets, not embarrassing failures. Justice had been served, but her real journey was just beginning. 2 years later, Rachel Thompson adjusted her captain's uniform and walked through the crew entrance at Denver International Airport, her steps confident and purposeful. The wings on her collar caught the morning light. She had completed her commercial pilot training with honors and earned her first command position with Mountain West Airlines. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was departing from the same airport where Weber had once told her she was unfit for aviation careers. His conviction had become a landmark case in federal aviation safety law, and the protocols Rachel had developed as safety compliance coordinator were now implemented at airports across the country. Captain Thompson, our first officer, a young man named Kevin Jang, approached with the pre-flight paperwork. I've completed the aircraft inspection. Everything's in perfect order. Rachel smiled at the respectful tone. Kevin was fresh out of flight school himself, eager and nervous about flying with a captain whose safety advocacy had made her something of a legend in aviation circles. Her story had been featured in pilot training programs as an example of professional courage and systematic thinking under pressure. Excellent work, Kevin. Let's review the weather reports and flight plan together. As they walked toward their aircraft, a regional jet bound for Seattle, the same route that Flight 982 had attempted that fateful day, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The civilian flight school captain Harrison had recommended had been exactly what she needed. Rigorous technical training combined with real-world emergency scenarios that built confidence rather than tearing it down. Unlike her Air Force experience, where instructors had focused on her emotional responses under pressure, the civilian program had recognized that her analytical approach to crisis situations was actually a strength. Her ability to systematically assess problems and implement solutions had made her an exceptional student pilot. Captain Thompson? Kevin's voice interrupted her thoughts. I have to ask, is it true that you once prevented a major safety violation while working as an airport administrator? Rachel considered how to answer. Her story had been told and retold so many times that it sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else. But she recognized the hero worship in Kevin's voice and wanted to give him something more valuable than a legend. I recognized a pattern of dangerous practices and found the courage to speak up about it, she said simply. The same skills that make someone a good pilot, observation, analysis, and decisive action, can be applied to any aviation safety situation. But weren't you afraid of the consequences? I mean, challenging a superior like that could have ended your career. Rachel paused at the aircraft door, looking back toward the terminal where she'd once sat in Weber's office, feeling worthless and defeated. Kevin, let me tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was your age. Your job as a pilot isn't just to fly the airplane. It's to be the final authority on the safety of everyone who trusts you with their lives. That authority comes with the responsibility to speak up when something's wrong, regardless of who disagrees with you. Kevin nodded seriously, absorbing the lesson. Besides, Rachel added with a slight smile, sometimes the thing that seems like it might end your career actually turns out to be the thing that saves it. Their pre-flight inspection was thorough and methodical. Rachel had developed a reputation for extensive safety checks, and Kevin was learning to appreciate the way she involved him in every decision. Unlike Weber's authoritarian approach to leadership, Rachel's style was collaborative while maintaining clear lines of responsibility. Cabin crew reports ready for departure, came the voice from the intercom. 112 passengers aboard, all safety demonstrations complete. Rachel settled into the captain's seat and began her final instrument checks. Through the cockpit window, she could see the airport operations center where she'd once worked under Weber's harassment. Director Foster was still in charge there, and the safety protocols Rachel had helped implement continued to prevent the kind of violations that had once put passengers at risk. Denver Tower, this is Mountain West 477 requesting taxi clearance. Rachel spoke into her headset, her voice calm and professional. Mountain West 477, cleared to taxi runway 24 right. Wind calm, visibility unlimited. Have a safe flight, Captain Thompson. As the aircraft began moving toward the runway, Kevin glanced at her curiously. Did the tower controller use your name specifically? That's unusual. Rachel smiled. I used to work here. Some of the old-timers remember me. What she didn't tell Kevin was that many of the air traffic controllers, ground crew, and operations staff still recognized her as the person who had stood up to Weber's dangerous practices. Her willingness to risk her career for passenger safety had earned her respect that went far beyond normal professional courtesy. Mountain West 477, cleared for takeoff runway 24 right. Rachel advanced the throttle smoothly, feeling the familiar surge of power as the engines responded. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, and at exactly the right moment, she pulled back on the yoke and felt the landing gear leave the ground. They climbed steadily into the clear Colorado sky, and Rachel experienced the same sense of freedom and purpose that had first drawn her to aviation as a teenager. But now that feeling was tempered with hard-earned wisdom about the responsibilities that came with commanding an aircraft. "First officer's aircraft," she said, transferring control to Kevin as they reached cruising altitude. "You have the plane." "I have the aircraft," Kevin confirmed, taking the controls with the confidence of proper training. Rachel leaned back and gazed out at the mountain ranges below. Somewhere down there, Weber was serving his federal sentence and learning that corruption eventually catches up with those who practice it. The airline executives who had pressured him were dealing with ongoing federal oversight and massive financial penalties. The system that had once protected their dangerous practices had ultimately held them accountable. More importantly, hundreds of pilots were now being trained with enhanced safety protocols that emphasized individual responsibility and systematic thinking. Rachel's story had become part of that training, but she was proud that the focus was on the principles she demonstrated rather than on her personal struggle. "Captain Thompson," Kevin's voice carried a note of concern. "I'm seeing some unusual readings on the hydraulic pressure gauges. Probably nothing serious, but I thought you should know." Rachel immediately focused on the instrument panel, her trained eyes scanning the system indicators. The readings were within normal ranges, but showed a slight irregularity that could indicate developing problems. "Good catch, Kevin. Let's run a diagnostic check and see what the system tells us." As they worked through the troubleshooting procedures, Rachel felt a familiar sense of calm focus. This was what she'd been trained for. Not just the routine flights when everything worked perfectly, but the moments when careful attention and decisive action made the difference between safe operations and potential emergencies. The diagnostic revealed a minor hydraulic pump irregularity that would require attention during their scheduled maintenance check, but posed no immediate safety risk. Rachel made the appropriate log entries and notified maintenance control of the situation. "How did you stay so calm?" Kevin asked as they completed the paperwork. "For a minute there, I was worried we might have a serious problem." "Experience," Rachel replied, "and the knowledge that panic never solved any aviation problem. Clear thinking, proper procedures, and good communication. Those are the tools that keep everyone safe." As their aircraft began its descent towards Seattle, Rachel realized that her journey from failed Air Force cadet to commercial captain had taught her something valuable about the nature of success and failure. Weber had tried to convince her that her military washout meant she was unfit for aviation careers, but the truth was that every experience, including the failures, had contributed to making her the pilot she was today. Her analytical approach to crisis situations, her systematic documentation skills, and her willingness to challenge authority when safety was at stake had all been developed through her struggles with Weber's corruption. The woman who now commanded commercial aircraft with confidence and competence had been forged in the conflict with a man who tried to destroy her career. "Seattle approach, Mountain West 477 with you at 8,000 feet. Requesting vectors for approach. Mountain West 477, turn left heading 270, descend and maintain 6,000. Expect ILS approach runway 16 left." As Rachel guided the aircraft through the approach procedures, She thought about the passengers behind her, who trusted their lives to her skill and judgment. Some might be nervous flyers who needed reassurance. Others might be experienced travelers who took aviation safety for granted. All of them deserved a captain who put their welfare above every other consideration. The landing was smooth and precise, and as the aircraft rolled to a stop at the gate, Rachel felt the quiet satisfaction of another successful flight completed safely. The passengers would disembark and continue their journeys, most of them never knowing the name of the captain who had brought them safely to their destination. That anonymity was exactly as it should be. Rachel had learned that true leadership in aviation wasn't about recognition or authority. It was about the daily commitment to excellence and safety that protected people who trusted you with their lives. "Nice flight, Captain," Kevin said as they completed their post-flight checks. "I learned a lot today." "Good," Rachel replied, "because tomorrow we'll face new challenges that will require everything you've learned and more." That's what makes aviation such an incredible profession. You never stop growing, you never stop learning, and you never stop proving that you deserve the trust people place in you. As Rachel walked through the Seattle terminal toward her hotel, she passed a newsstand displaying aviation magazines. One featured an article about recent improvements in airline safety protocols, with her photo accompanying a sidebar about whistleblower protections for aviation employees. She didn't stop to read the article. Her story had been told enough times. And what mattered now was not the past struggles, but the future flights that would test her skills and judgment as a captain. Tomorrow, she would return to Denver with another full load of passengers counting on her expertise and integrity. Weber had tried to ground her dreams, but she had risen above his corruption and found her true calling in the sky. The passenger who had once been told she was unfit to fly had become the captain who would spend her career ensuring that other passengers reached their destinations safely. Justice had been served, careers had been redeemed, and the sky remained infinite with possibilities for those brave enough to reach for them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.